Prepare!
Hey guys, what's up? MadSeason here, back with another video for you. There are rumblings of a classic recreation of the Burning Crusade, just like how they did with Vanilla, so I thought it would be an interesting video to break down the biggest differences between the two. On the surface, it seems simple. Classic is successful, so do the same thing that you did with Classic to the Burning Crusade, but the first difference will become apparent very quickly, and that's class balance. It's undeniable. The class balance in Classic is pretty bad. We all know the situation. Someone rolls a Retribution Paladin, you want to raid, and either they're denied a spot entirely, or they're kind of made fun of for being a meme spec. I like Ret Pallies though, and I say that as a warrior. You ever have that ugly friend you'd walk next to make yourself look better? That's the relationship between a Ret Pally and a warrior. We'll see if I'm still in a guild after that one, but on a serious note, I think there is a guild for everyone, and you definitely can find a guild as a Ret Pally or a Boomkin, or whatever non-optimal spec you want to play, but it's definitely harder. I mean, it's understandable. It's the growing pains in the game's birth. World of Warcraft set the standard of what MMOs were in the mid-2000s. When you have no set standard, it's common to have extremely awkward or clunky things such as uneven class balance. It's not without its pluses. It's part of the charm, I think. It gives everyone a unique role and niche, but this is something that was vastly improved in the Burning Crusade. No longer are Retribution Paladins the butt of all jokes in PvE. They're actually pretty good, especially if you're Horde. Speaking of Horde and Alliance balance though, it's also in the Burning Crusade is when the Alliance got Shamans with the Draenei race, and the Horde got Paladins with the Blood Elf race. In Classic, you have an advantage or disadvantage depending on your faction for certain fights, and even the meta of endgame raiding. For example, two-handed Fury Warriors are much better on Horde than they are on Alliance due to the Wind Fury totem. But back to general class balance, Shadow Priests had their mana issues addressed, Protection Paladins got a taunt, Druid tanks were both literally and figuratively beasts. In DPS, tanking, and healing, every class and spec got much closer to each other in viability for both PvE and PvP. So in the context of re-releases, where you see this hyper min-maxing, players won't be punished as much for picking a spec that they didn't know was weaker in the grand scheme of things. In the context of re-releases, knowledge is power. It's still true in BC, but in the context of class balance, it's less punishing than compared to Classic. Since the dawn of time, man has dreamed of breaking free from his gravitational prison and taking to the skies, and apparently peeing on people. But next, we have something just as controversial as that, and that's of course flight. The Outland was the first area in the game where you could actually fly. Unlocked at level 70, it cost a hefty amount of gold, or sex for the more industrious players, but that's another story, and was trainable in 2 different speeds. And with the birth of flying, also came the argument of if it's good or bad for the game. It's more convenient, it makes the world seem small, it's the natural progression, it ruins world PvP. I think for BC it's fine, because after all, the zones were designed around it. You couldn't even zone into the Tempest Keep without it, and until a certain patch, you couldn't even summon people up there. Whatever your thoughts are, it's in the game and the Outland, and it's a big change from what players are used to in Classic. World PvP isn't the only avenue to blow off some steam, however. The Burning Crusade also saw the release of the Arena PvP system, where teams of 2, 3, or 5 square off against each other in a no-holds-barred deathmatch. Whereas in Classic, where the PvP system rewarded more time investment than anything, this is where the men are separated from the slightly more sweaty and unkept men. You play matches, gain or lose ranking, and earn points, and these points are then spent on special PvP gear, which is locked by ranking. There is a certain skill involved in the old rank 14 PvP system certainly. Just being a good PvPer and knowing the battlegrounds and having good teamwork will go a long ways, but it primarily just makes the grind smoother and quicker. Whereas with arenas, if you're not good enough to advance in the next rank, you're not good enough. You can't just play X amount more matches and reap the same rewards as the more skilled players. compositions and synergy will be key. The matches will be long because this is before any sort of heal dampening. It's arena in its raw form, and only the most sweaty will survive.
This is where the big boys play, huh? Look at the adjective, play.
An astute observation, but I'd like to focus on that other adjective, survive. Classic PvP, you may have noticed, is on the bursty side. Just a little bit. I swear I'll be able to control my character next time I resurrect. Sometimes you blink and you'll be at the graveyard. This was also a huge change in the Burning Crusade, however, with the addition of a very special stat, and that's resilience. This reduced a player's chance to be on the receiving end of a critical strike, and not only that, even if they did get crit, they would take reduced damage. You still had spiky damage, but it was nowhere near on the level of an elemental shaman literally globaling you every 2 minutes, like with what you have in Classic. It makes for a much more methodical style of PvP, which some like and some hate. It really is big though, and combined with the finer tuned class balance, the face of PvP was changed with the Burning Crusade expansion. And next, we just have some other stats in general. Expertise saw a release in the Burning Crusade, which when stacked, reduced an enemy's chance to dodge or parry you. Armor penetration is another stat that rose to the forefront. This, as you would guess, allowed you to ignore a certain amount of your target's armor for your attacks. I think technically first introduced in Classic, but it became a much more common stat in BC, and in combination with resilience and expertise, you really had quite the selection of stats to choose from and how you wanted to build your character. One of the things to aid you in this was Jewelcrafting, as players could cut gems into special stat increases. Resilience, like I mentioned, expertise, stamina, strength. These would fit into special colored sockets and gear pieces, and it was much more in depth in its original form. Today, gear pieces have a chance to randomly proc a socket, and you slap one in there, and that's it. However, in BC, these sockets had their own color, and if you matched the correct color gems, you would receive a socket bonus. You could only get certain stats from certain colored gems, so it created this choice of just zerging one stat, or maybe getting less optimal stats if the bonus was good enough. And not only this, but special meta gems that you could only put in your head socket. These are typically more powerful, providing unique affixes instead of just raw stats. So this, combined with the new stats, made the gear choices that much more interesting, and the loot system as a whole really thrived in the Burning Crusade. But there's more to it than all of this. It's easy to just list the new features introduced with BC, but what about the more philosophical effects? For the next items on our list, I wanted to focus on the more abstract aspects of the expansion, and even re-releases in general. Returning to Classic for a moment, I posed this question earlier in the video. Is it still hard? Well, in the context of Classic raiding, no, not really. Raids and bosses that took several months to clear in the original release took just hours to clear in the re-release, as our collective skill as players has grown exponentially since release, and remains to be one of the bigger weak points with the game, at least in my opinion. And if the re-release has proven anything, it's that the skill gap between vanilla release and today is incredibly large. The skill gap between the Burning Crusade and current is another story, however. Undoubtedly, we've grown in skill since then. Do you remember your first time picking up a controller? It's like those movies or commercials where they're pretending to play a video game. Just look at the old raiding videos. The best raiders in Classic were a bunch of keyboard-turning, backpedaling 12-year-olds. These are the people who held your life in their hands. What I'm getting at here is if you were to map a player's skill on a graph between vanilla and today, it would look something like this. By the time the Burning Crusade came out, we were probably around here as far as the skill gap is concerned, because your first time doing anything leaves an insane amount of room for improvement, and as a result, the raids were tuned to a difficulty level much closer to today than in vanilla. People will still clear through the raids faster, no doubt, but it would be nowhere near the level it's being done in Classic. In the Burning Crusade, you had many bosses that were deemed to be unkillable until they got a nerf by Blizzard. You hear legends even today of pre-nerf Muru or Kael'thas, and when people bring up raiding in the Burning Crusade, the conversation will inevitably turn to how much of a struggle it was, even with 3 to 4 years of experience by the most hardcore. Ultimately, this will depend on Blizzard if they release these bosses in their original or post-nerf states. It definitely has the potential though. And since I mentioned the word, let's explore this further. There's no denying that Classic is a game of optimization. It's before a time where everything is hyper-balanced, and that any item or buff that could give you an edge is disabled, nerfed, or removed in the context of raiding or competitive PvP. This creates the perfect microcosm for min-maxing. Obscure level 40 quest rewards can make or break the meta of endgame PvP. Rest assured that if it were in the game, a level 5 quest that requires you to kill 4,627 boars for plus 5 strength would be grinded out ad nauseum for that 0.0001% increase in EP size and those precious parses. You think the fact that this world buff is only available to the opposite faction is enough for you to not get it? Nah, fam. Just pay for that second account and go level that priest alt and mind control yourself to get it. And yes, this is something that actually happens. Some guilds require it, in fact. Flasking in PvE, flasking in PvP, flasking in ERP. The game is drowning in a deluge of sweat so thick you can almost smell it. It's like a speedrunning convention. Okay, I'm being a bit mean now. If that's what you like, that's what you like, and I've dabbled in it here and there. But as the game has evolved, awkward time sinks such as this have faded away, and many are surprised to learn that it started as early as the Burning Crusade. The buffs themselves, and even many items, had their effectiveness reduced for level 70 content. Gone are the days of half the server camping a level 40 rare with a 2-day spawn timer for a green level 36 trinket, and the playing field is evened out between those who have 6 hours a day to play and those who have 20 hours a day to play. This can be seen as a negative or a positive, depending on your opinion. It's definitely more casual friendly in this aspect, which some like and some hate. Typically, if you're the type who doesn't like the min-max culture, you're gonna like it more since it requires less of a time investment to stay on the same playing field. There's less preparation involved, and it's more in the actual gameplay. Personally, it's never bothered me, but I can see where people can get that opinion. It's like inviting friends over for a game of Monopoly, and having that overly competitive friend who spends the last 2 weeks preparing, studying tournament Monopoly play, if that exists, and has been practicing 14 hours a day. And that's not to say that there isn't min-maxing in the game. I mean, I just got done explaining how people lament on the extreme difficulty of Burning Crusade raiding. If you're a progression guild, it almost demanded min-maxing. It's just a more conventional style of building your character properly and managing your rotation, as opposed to farming world buffs for 3 hours before raid or camping level 40 rares. Speaking of progression though, next we have something that always surprises people when they first hear it. Raids in the Burning Crusade were extremely unique in the fact that most of them were out at the expansion's release. There's an asterisk tied to that, as they were locked by gear checks and attunements. To zone into these raids, you'd have to finish the raid in the previous tier through a massive attunement chain, but technically it was within the player's control when they entered these raids. This is unheard of today. Even in vanilla, we had just the Molten Core and an Ixion release, and then the other raids of course slowly over time when Blizzard said so. Never before, nor after the Burning Crusade expansion, was this type of freedom given to players, and in the context of re-releases, it'll be a very interesting thing to see how fast players can progress. In the context of re-releases, where you're fighting against that increased skill and familiarity, this will be something that's wholly unique to the Burning Crusade expansion. You never know with the most extreme of the extreme, but for the average guild, I think the progress will be much slower compared to that of Classic, and it'll be quite the intense race, spanning months most likely. And one last point that I wanted to bring up, and I don't want to get too crazy with this because I'm an editor, not a programmer, but in the recreation of Classic, in their BlizzCon panel in 2018, they explained how Classic came to be, and how they sort of scraped together the old source code and data from back in the day. It turned out that an ex-employee or something just happened to have the data on an old hard drive, and that it barely had 1.12, and a little bit before. With a 6-phase schedule, they covered most of the major stuff. All of the raids, of course, the PvP system, battlegrounds, and even certain items deemed to be too powerful for the initial re-release. Some players, however, lament on a more detailed re-release, where things such as class balance are also tied into the 6-phase schedule. Classes changed wildly from the release of the original to 1.12. Many of you know about that bleed talent that hunters used to have as their crown jewel of the survival tree, or maybe that death coil didn't have the horrify effect, and so on. Abilities added, abilities removed, abilities buffed to extreme heights, and abilities nerfed into oblivion. Now, in my opinion, at the end of the day, this doesn't have as big of an effect on raid progression as people say. I mean, I'm pretty sure that frost mages dealing 20% more damage than they should isn't the reason why Ragnaros was killed within 1 week instead of 5 months. I think it's just a drop in the ocean compared to not being absolutely awful like we were back then, as well as full video guides, the min-max culture, best in slot lists, and so on and so forth. But still, I think having progressive class balance can only be a good thing for the game for a few reasons. One is for balance, although again, I think it's minor. It couldn't hurt. Like I said, I think one of the bigger issues with Classic is that it's too easy, so a little more difficulty certainly wouldn't hurt. But more importantly is that it combats that stagnation, which is another one of its bigger issues. The more that the game is changing, the less the established norm and meta dominates, and it just keeps things more dynamic in general. It's like, oh cool, this is the patch where we get this talent, or I'm a little stronger against this class now in PvP. The stagnation is a tough cookie to crumble, because how do you battle it without changing the game? Well, the only way really is to emulate the game and its original changes as they were back then, and I think things such as class balance, talents, and spells and so on would make the game seem more alive and changing. Again, I don't pretend to be a programmer here, but from my understanding, one of the reasons why they didn't go down this road for Classic is that the data they had was limited mainly to later patches like 1.12. So, the idea I'm getting at here is that since the Burning Crusade came out later, there's a better chance that they have the data of all patches so they can better emulate how the game has evolved in even more detailed levels, such as class balance, creating a much more dynamic experience for the players. Some argue that they simply didn't want to put in the effort, which could be true. From this though, you can make an argument that due to the success of Classic, they might take BC more seriously. Everyone underestimated Classic, Blizzard included. They started off with just 12 servers in the US, and since they got swamped, today we're at 40. Using this logic and seeing the bigger demand is something that they may find to be more worth exploring since they now know the potential. At this point though, we're speculating about speculation. Honestly, this video is a bit premature because who knows if it's even going to be a thing. I mean, I said in the last video not to get your hopes up, and here I am. It's fun to talk and speculate about though. I guess it's just my way of dealing with the excitement. I personally think that the survey is a very telling thing though, and I'm pretty optimistic as you can tell. And who knows, maybe this video will help encourage some feedback. By all means, let Blizzard know if you want Burning Crusade servers. With that survey, it proves that they're listening to the player base on this, so let your voice be heard. I'll always be Classic at heart, because that's my jam personally, but the Burning Crusade is right there, and I think that anyone who likes Classic would like BC and vice versa. So, hoping for the best. Hopefully I brought up some interesting stuff in this video for you. Like it if you liked it, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.
Farewell for now, mortals. We hope you enjoyed today's video. See you again soon.